For most people today, dancing is a celebration, something joyful, expressive, and deeply human. But centuries ago, across different cultures and rigid societies, dancing was not only discouraged, it was feared, condemned, and in many cases, criminalized. To understand how something so harmless became treated like a dangerous act, we must go back to the roots of early beliefs that shaped entire communities. In many societies, movement of the body was directly tied to the spirit. People believed that certain motions could invite unseen forces or loosen the soul, making a person vulnerable to influence. The body was seen as a gateway, and any act that made it sway, bend, twist, or spin too freely was viewed with suspicion. Even simple rhythmic stepping was labeled as losing control, something respectable people were taught to avoid. Religious authorities also played a major role. Many early religious leaders saw dancing as a threat to discipline, claiming it weakened moral strength and pulled people toward temptation. To them, dancing wasn't just motion, it was disorder. It encouraged freedom when society demanded obedience. It encouraged expression when silence was preferred. And above all, it encouraged individuality when the community valued strict conformity. Even families adopted these beliefs. A child who enjoyed dancing was often warned that it would bring shame or spiritual danger. Parents feared neighbors labeling them as irresponsible if they allowed their children to move too freely. Houses rang with warnings like "stand still, control yourself, and do not draw attention to your body." Movement was treated as a sign of instability, something that invited distrust. As these beliefs hardened, dancing transformed from a simple act into something forbidden. It became a symbol of rebellion. And in societies where conformity kept order, rebellion, even harmless rebellion, became a threat. Over time, villages created rules, communities developed punishments, and leaders preached speeches that made dancing seem like a path to chaos. This was the beginning of a long era when people learned to suppress natural joy out of fear. What started as superstition slowly became law, and soon dancing would not just be discouraged, it would be treated as a crime. Centuries ago, authority was not just political, it was deeply personal. Leaders governed not only laws but behaviors, emotions, and even the way bodies were allowed to move. Once dancing became associated with disorder, it wasn't long before leaders took it upon themselves to regulate it. They viewed dancing as an open door to misbehavior, and they were determined to close it. Village councils and town elders began drafting rules that controlled public gatherings. Any event involving rhythmic movement, from celebrations to small family feasts, came under suspicion. Leaders claimed these gatherings encouraged wildness, lowered discipline, and could even infect the minds of the young. Their words carried weight. In places where survival depended on unity, anything that seemed to disrupt order became a target. Punishments were often disguised as protective measures. People caught dancing in certain places were fined for disturbing the peace. Others faced public warnings meant to shame them back into obedience. In some areas, dancing after sunset was banned entirely, labeled as nighttime mischief linked to immorality. Even harmless movements were misinterpreted. A person tapping their foot to a rhythm could receive a warning. A group humming a tune while walking might be stopped and questioned. Authority figures began seeing patterns where none existed, convinced that even small acts of rhythm were the beginning of something dangerous. Parents were encouraged to monitor their children closely. A child who enjoyed music or naturally swayed to sound was viewed with concern. Families feared being judged by neighbors or scolded by officials. Children learned quickly to suppress any urge to move joyfully. They stood rigid at gatherings, spoke softly, and avoided anything that resembled dancing. Schools reinforced the rules. Teachers punished students for excessive movement, calling it lack of discipline. Standing still became a measure of good character. Rhythm became associated with rebellion, and dancing, even without music, became something that could tarnish a reputation. This rigid environment turned everyday life into a series of cautionary steps where every movement was monitored and every expression measured.
Dancing had become more than a frowned-upon act. It was now treated as a sign of danger. Authorities had successfully transformed joy into misconduct. And this was only the beginning.
As the belief grew stronger, communities began to fear that dancing was contagious, not in a physical sense, but in a psychological one. They believed that seeing someone dance could weaken others' self-control, spreading disorder through the village like a quiet wave. Dancing became something that infected minds, a force capable of breaking down structure and discipline. People began to distance themselves from anyone known to enjoy dancing. A person seen moving too freely was avoided in markets, whispered about in gatherings, and treated as someone who could influence the young in dangerous ways. Villagers believed that even watching a dancer could corrupt a person's spirit, making them more vulnerable to temptation or rebellion. Children were taught to look away if they saw someone sway or laugh too freely. Young people were warned that dancers were lost or possessed by impulses. Families tightened their rules, restricting celebrations and limiting music in their homes. Even instruments were treated with caution, as if their sounds carried invisible risks. Communities created rituals to cleanse public spaces where dancing had taken place. These practices were not merely symbolic, they reflected a deep-rooted fear. People believed that rhythm left behind traces, echoes that could influence anyone who walked through the area. By cleansing the space, leaders reassured villagers that order had been restored, even if nothing physical had changed. Festivals that once brought joy gradually disappeared. People attended only the most necessary events, and even then avoided anything that looked like celebration. A simple smile or a moment of shared joy became suspect, as if happiness itself were dangerous. Movement turned into something guarded and controlled. Villagers lived under an invisible pressure, constantly monitoring themselves and others. It created a culture of fear where natural instincts were suppressed and community life became rigid, quiet, and tense. Dancing had become a symbol of everything that threatened stability, and fear now governed behavior more strongly than any written rule. In this environment, even the slightest movement could create suspicion, and suspicion, once formed, was difficult to erase. As religious influence continued to shape daily life, dancing became tied to moral warnings. Religious leaders insisted that dancing was not only dangerous, but sinful. They preached that the body should remain controlled, quiet, and humble. Movement was associated with temptation, and temptation was believed to lead people away from spiritual discipline. Sermons often described dancing as an open door for improper desires. Leaders warned that the body's rhythm could awaken impulses that disrupted the purity of the mind. Even harmless dancing among children was condemned, said to weaken their character and expose them to spiritual corruption. Congregations absorbed these messages deeply. People internalized the belief that dancing led to a weakened spirit. They feared judgment, both from religious leaders and from their neighbors who watched closely for signs of improper behavior. Religious gatherings emphasized stillness, silence, and restraint. Any form of movement outside the prescribed norms became associated with wrongdoing. Families became particularly strict. Parents discouraged any form of playful movement. Even during celebrations, people were expected to remain motionless, offering only polite nods or soft smiles. The idea that dancing could offend higher powers created a culture where joy was monitored and expressions of freedom were suppressed. Events that once brought communities together gradually turned into formal, rigid gatherings. People no longer laughed freely or moved naturally. Standing still became a sign of faithfulness. Dancing became a mark of moral weakness.
In time, this belief shaped generations. Children grew up hearing warnings about the dangers of movement, absorbing the idea that their bodies could betray them. Even those who felt the natural urge to dance learned to hide it, fearing punishment or social isolation. Dancing had become more than a forbidden act, it was now a spiritual violation.
As suspicion deepened, punishments became more severe. Communities began treating dancers as troublemakers, even if their actions were harmless. Parents punished children who moved too freely. Teachers scolded students who tapped their feet or swayed during lessons. Adults received public warnings, fines, or social exclusion for being too expressive. Some places introduced physical punishments. A person caught dancing could be made to stand still in public as shame. Others were forced to sit in silence for long periods to reset their discipline. These punishments were not just meant to control behavior, they were designed to reshape identity. Fear spread. People became afraid of their own bodies. They monitored every gesture, every step, worried that accidental rhythm could be misunderstood. A simple moment of joy could lead to shame. This fear created generations of emotionally restricted individuals who equated happiness with danger. As punishments grew, celebrations transformed into silent gatherings. Music was discouraged or removed entirely. Families stopped hosting events that involved movement. Weddings, once joyful occasions, became serious ceremonies with carefully controlled behavior. Communities believed removing dancing would preserve order. Instead, it removed joy. Children grew up in quiet environments where playfulness was monitored. Adults lived cautiously, fearing judgment from neighbors. Even during major life events, people avoided expressing happiness too visibly. Movement became a rare act. Joy became private, hidden, and suppressed. Dancing, once a symbol of freedom, had become an act of defiance. By the time strict rules had shaped multiple generations, people forgot that dancing had once been innocent. They believed the fear had always existed. Children raised in silence grew into adults who passed the same fear onto their own families. Some felt an urge to move, but suppressed it. Others watched in silence as their children expressed natural joy, only to correct them with the same warnings they once heard. Not because they wanted to, because they didn't know any other way. Dancing had been erased not by force, but by belief. A belief powerful enough to reshape culture, redefine morality, and rewrite the meaning of joy. And slowly, societies lost something deeply human without realizing it. If you were born in a time when dancing was treated like a crime, would you choose to stay still to remain accepted, or dance anyway and risk being punished for joy? Subscribe so you don't miss the next video.